We need to write chapter 1 of a 12ch after sci-fi story titled The Dreadnought that SW allowed our Armada ASF. The instruction: write chapter 1 of 12, build extreme tension. Each chapter must be very long and incredibly detailed. Output only the narrative text so it reads seamlessly. Here is the story so far, but then here is the story so far is empty. So no prior context. We need to invent the beginning. The title suggests a Dreadnought massive war's hip that swall ows an Armada. First person. Our Armada implies a narrator from the Armada. ASF might be an acronym, All-Wide Space Fleet, Armada Space Force. We'll set up a tense situation. An Armada encounters a mysterious Dreadnought. Chapter 1 should establish setting, characters, and build suspense leading to the first encounter or the beginning of the swallowing. Must be very long and detailed. Output only narrative text. Let's write. The signal came from the edge of the Cygnus Rift, a whisper of static buried beneath 17 layers of encrypted handshake protocols. It was faint, almost lost in the cosmic background radiation, but the algorithm on the hammer of Saul's bridge flagged it within milliseconds. Lieutenant Commander Elias Voss watched the alert flash across his tactical display, a single amber glyph pulsing against the deep blue of the star map. He had been on watch for 11 hours, his eyes dry and his jaw tight from the constant low-grade hum of the ship's reactors. The rest of the Armada stretched out behind him in a formation that had taken 3 days to perfect. 47 capital ships, 112 escorts, and 6 logistical support vessels, all arrayed in a staggered delta that covered nearly 200,000 kilometers of space. They were the second expeditionary fleet, the largest concentration of human firepower ever sent beyond the Orion Spur, and they were hunting a ghost. The ghost had a name, though it was rarely spoken aloud. The Leviathan, or the Dreadnought as the intelligence briefs called it, always capitalized. First contact had been 6 months ago, when a deep space surveyor near the Helix Nebula had returned a single image before going dark, a silhouette against a dying star, a shape that defied conventional naval architecture. It was massive, far larger than any vessel humanity had ever built, with a hull that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The surveyor's final transmission had been cut mid-word, the audio a garbled scream of data corruption. Since then, 5 more ships had vanished along the same trajectory, each one a little closer to the inner systems. The fleet had been assembled in haste, a coalition of the Solar Republic, the Jovian Confederacy, and the Outer Rim territories, all united by a common terror. They were not sent to make contact. They were sent to destroy. Voss rubbed the bridge of his nose and zoomed in on the signal's origin point. It was coming from a small, unnamed asteroid field at the edge of the rift, a region of space so dense with debris that standard navigation protocols forbade entry. The Hammer of Saul was the flagship, a kilometer-long dreadnought in its own right, bristling with railguns, missile pods, and point defense lasers. Its captain, a weathered woman named Helena Core, had been in command for 19 years. She had seen the worst of the Martian Civil War and the pirate purges of the asteroid belt, and she had never once shown fear. But when Voss looked up from his console and saw her standing at the center of the bridge, her hands clasped behind her back and her eyes fixed on the main view screen, he noticed a tension in her shoulders that he had never seen before. "What do we have, Lieutenant?" Core's voice was steady, but it carried an edge that cut through the ambient noise of the bridge. "Unidentified transmission, Captain, encrypted, but the handshake is human standard. It's repeating a single phrase in binary, approach with caution. Do not engage, repeat, do not engage." Voss paused, scanning the decryption logs. "It's coming from a derelict, sir. A Republic scout ship, the Grendel's Shadow. She went missing 4 months ago." The bridge fell silent. The Grendel's Shadow had been the 3rd vessel to vanish. Her captain, a man named Orlov, had been a friend of Core's. They had served together during the Jovian blockade, and his loss had hit her harder than she let on. Voss watched her jaw tighten, the muscles in her neck cording as she processed the information. "Is it a trap?" Commander Reyes, the ship's executive officer, stepped forward. He was a tall, thin man with a shaved head and a perpetually skeptical expression. "The Dreadnought has been silent this whole time. Why send a message now and through a ghost ship?" "Maybe it's not the Dreadnought," Voss said, though he didn't believe it. "Maybe the Grendel's shadow survived. Maybe Orlov is still alive. Or maybe something is using his ship as bait," Reyes countered. "Captain, I recommend we send a drone. We don't risk a crew until we know what we're dealing with." Kor did not respond immediately. She walked to the view screen, her boots clicking against the metal deck, and stared out at the blackness of space. The Cygnus Rift was a wound in the galaxy, a region of twisted gravity and fragmented stars that looked like shattered glass against the void. Somewhere in that chaos, the Dreadnought had been sighted last, a fleeting shadow on long-range sensors before it vanished again. Now this, a message from the dead. "We don't have time for drones," Kor said finally. "The fleet is already on high alert. If the Dreadnought is out there, it knows we're here. This message is the first sign of intelligence we've gotten from that region in months. I'm not going to ignore it." She turned to face the bridge crew, her eyes hard. "Lieutenant Voss, plot a course to the Grendel's shadow. Full stealth protocol. We'll take the Hammer and 2 escorts. The rest of the Armada holds position and maintains calm silence until we return." "Captain, that's a risk," Reyes said, his voice low. "If this is a trap, you're handing them our flagship." "If it's a trap, Commander, I want to see it coming." Kor's tone brooked no argument. "Voss, execute." The next 30 minutes were a blur of activity. Voss fed the coordinates into the navigation system, his fingers dancing across the holographic interface as he calculated the safest route through the asteroid field. The hammer of Saul's engines hummed to life, a deep vibration that resonated through the deck plates, and the ship began to move. 2 frigates, the Iron Will and the Sword of Dawn, fell into formation on either side, their own reactors glowing like distant stars. The rest of the Armada receded behind them, a constellation of lights that slowly dimmed as the distance grew. The asteroid field was a nightmare. Rocks the size of cities tumbled through the void, their trajectories chaotic and unpredictable. The Hammer's sensors painted a constantly shifting picture, and Voss had to manually override the autopilot 3 times to avoid collisions. The Grendel's shadow's beacon grew stronger as they approached, its signal cutting through the static with an eerie clarity. The message repeated every 30 seconds, the same binary phrase, the same flat tone: "Approach with caution. Do not engage. Do not engage." "Visual contact in 10 seconds, Voss announced, his voice tight. The bridge crew leaned forward, their eyes fixed on the main screen. The view was still black, just the faint glimmer of distant stars and the occasional flash of a tumbling asteroid. Then the Grendel's shadow emerged from behind a chunk of rock the size of a small moon, and the breath caught in Voss's throat. The ship was dead. That much was obvious. Its hull was pitted and scarred, its engines cold, its running lights extinguished. But it was intact, more or less. It floated in the void like a corpse, its bow tilted at a strange angle, its communication array still blinking with the message. The Grendel's shadow had been a sleek vessel once, a fast scout designed for long-range reconnaissance. Now it looked like a relic, a ghost ship adrift in a graveyard. "No thermal signatures," Reyes reported, his eyes scanning his console. "No power readings. Cold as space itself. But the transmitter is active. That's running on a backup battery and it's almost drained. Another few hours and it'll be silent." Kor studied the ship on the screen, her expression unreadable. Orlov knew his protocols. If he was still alive, he would have sent a distress signal, not a warning. He would have wanted us to find him. She paused. "This message was pre-recorded. Orlov didn't send it, something else did." "We should board," Voss said, surprising himself. He had no desire to set foot on that derelict, but the mystery gnawed at him. If there's data in the ship's logs, it could tell us what happened. What the Dreadnought is. Or it could be a bomb, Reyes muttered. Kor made her decision. "Prepare a boarding party. Lieutenant Voss, you'll lead it. Take 4 Marines and a tech specialist. You have 1 hour. If you find anything at all, you report back immediately. If you lose comms, we will assume the worst and destroy the Grendel's shadow from a distance. Understood. Voss nodded, his mouth dry. Understood, Captain. The boarding shuttle was a cramped, utilitarian craft designed for rapid insertion. Voss strapped himself into the seat next to Sergeant Tessa Holt, a grizzled Marine with a scar across her chin and a calm demeanor that belied the violence she was capable of. The other 3 Marines, Diaz, Chen, and Okonkwo, sat in silence, their weapons checked and rechecked. The tech specialist, a young woman named Dr. Anya Petrov, was already running diagnostics on her portable scanner, her fingers trembling slightly. Nervous? Voss asked her. Terrified, she admitted, not looking up. But also curious. That's the problem with scientists. We always want to know, even when knowing is the worst thing we can do. The shuttle detached from the hammer of Saul and began its slow approach to the Grendel's shadow. The derelict grew larger in the viewport, its details becoming clearer. The hull was covered in a fine layer of dust and debris, but there were no signs of battle damage. No laser scorches, no impact craters. It was as if the ship had simply stopped working, its crew vanishing into thin air. The docking port was still intact, and Voss guided the shuttle into a gentle alignment, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. The seal hissed as they connected. Voss took a deep breath and unstrapped himself. All right, let's see what Orlov left us. The airlock cycled open, and they stepped into the Grendel's shadow. The interior was dark, lit only by the emergency strips along the floor. The air was stale and cold, carrying a faint metallic tang that Voss recognized as the smell of vacuum exposure. The ship had been breached at some point, then resealed. That was not a good sign. Power is completely dead, Petrov said, her scanner glowing in the dim light. But the life support systems show a brief spike about 4 months ago. Someone turned them on, then off again. Deliberately. Or something, Holt said, her rifle raised. They moved through the corridors in a tight formation, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The Grendel's shadow was a small ship, and it took only a few minutes to reach the bridge. The door was open and the interior was bathed in the faint red glow of the emergency lights. Voss stepped inside and froze. The bridge was empty. No bodies, no signs of struggle, but the main console was active, its screen displaying a single line of text in blocky white letters. Welcome, I have been waiting. Contact the hammer, Voss said, his voice barely a whisper. Now. Diaz tapped his comm unit. Nothing, he tried again. Comms dead, sir, we're cut off. The screen flickered and the text changed. Do not be alarmed. I am not your enemy. I am the messenger. The Dreadnought is coming. You must warn the fleet. Who are you? Voss demanded, his hand moving to his sidearm. I was Captain Orlov. I'm still Captain Orlov, but I am also something else. The Dreadnought does not destroy. ITABSORBS. IT integrates. I am part of it now, and I have broken free to warn you. You cannot fight it. You cannot even run. The only hope is to surrender before it takes you. Surrender and you may survive. Resist and you will become part of it, just as I have. The screen went dark. The emergency lights flickered and died, plunging the bridge into absolute blackness. Voss heard Petrov gasp, heard the Marines shift their weapons. Then a new sound began, a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The deck vibrated beneath their feet. The walls began to groan. We need to leave, Holt said, her voice tight. Now. They stumbled back through the corridors, the hum growing louder, the ship shaking around them. The airlock was still open, the shuttle still attached. Voss shoved Petrov through, then the Marines, then dove in himself, slamming the hatch shut. The shuttle's engines roared to life, and they pulled away from the Grendel's shadow just as the derelict's hull began to twist, its metal screaming as it crumpled in on itself. The ship collapsed into a ball of debris, and then, impossibly, the debris began to move, swirling into a vortex that glowed with a sickly green light. Get us back to the hammer, Voss shouted. But as the shuttle turned, the main viewport showed something far worse. Beyond the asteroid field, beyond the Grendel's shadow's grave, the stars themselves began to warp. A shape was emerging from the rift, a shadow so vast that it blotted out the light of entire constellations. It was the Dreadnought, and it was coming for the Armada. Voss's comm unit crackled to life, the voice of Captain Core cutting through the static, strained and urgent. All ships, battle stations. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill. The Dreadnought has been sighted. It is moving faster than anything we have ever seen. Prepare for engagement. The shuttle lurched as a shockwave hit it, and Voss clung to his seat, his mind racing. Orlov's message echoed in his head: you cannot fight it. Surrender and you may survive. But surrender was not in the fleet's doctrine. They had come to destroy the monster, not to bow to it. The Dreadnought grew larger, its hull a void that drank the light. And then it opened its maw, a rift in its forward section that yawned wide, a gravitational pull that reached out across the void. The Sword of Dawn, one of the escorts, was the first to go. It tried to turn to fire its engines, but the pull was irresistible. It slid toward the Dreadnought, its hull crumpling like paper as it was drawn into the darkness. The Iron Will followed moments later, its weapons firing uselessly at the void. Voss watched in horror as the Armada's 2 escorts were swallowed whole. And then he realized the Dreadnought was not just consuming them. It was changing them. The debris that emerged from the rift was different, twisted, fused, alive. The ships were becoming part of the Dreadnought, their metal screaming as it was reshaped into something new. The Hammer of Saul opened fire. Railguns, missiles, lasers, all struck the Dreadnought's hull, and all were absorbed without effect. The Dreadnought did not even slow. It continued its advance, its maw widening, its pull intensifying. Voss felt the shuttle shudder, felt the gravity clawing at him, pulling him toward the void. He closed his eyes and thought of Orlov's message: surrender and you may survive. But it was already too late. The Dreadnought had swallowed the Sword of Dawn and the Iron Will. Now it was coming for the Hammer of Saul. And behind the flagship, the rest of the Armada was waiting, unaware that they were already dead. Chapter 2. The maw of silence, the Hammer of Saul, trembled as the Dreadnought's pull intensified, its colossal bulk blotting out the stars like a curtain of annihilation. The bridge was a storm of voices, alarms, and the shriek of metal under strain. Voss's shuttle, still tethered to the flagship's docking corridor, rattled as though it were a toy caught in the breath of a god. The Dreadnought's maw widened further, a wound in space itself, its edges shimmering with a sickly distortion that bent reality into grotesque shapes. The Sword of Dawn and Iron Will were gone, consumed and spat back as twisted amalgams of steel and flesh, their outlines barely recognizable as ships. They clung to the Dreadnought's hull like barnacles, alive yet screaming in silence. Captain Core's voice thundered across the comms: all batteries fire at will. Do not relent. The Hammer's railguns roared, streaks of molten tungsten tearing through the void. Missiles streaked outward, their contrails glowing against the abyss. Lasers lanced across the Dreadnought's surface, carving lines of light that vanished into nothingness. Every weapon, every desperate strike was swallowed whole. The Dreadnought did not flinch. It did not bleed. It simply advanced. Voss's knuckles whitened as he gripped the shuttle's console. He could feel it, the pull, the hunger. It wasn't just gravity. It was something deeper, something that clawed at the mind as much as the body. A whisper threaded through the static of the comms, faint but undeniable. You are already mine. He jerked his head, scanning the cabin. Orlov's warning echoed again in his skull: surrender and you may survive. But the fleet did not surrender. The fleet fought until the last ember burned out. The Hammer of Saul's engines flared, straining against the pull. The flagship's hull groaned, its plating warping as invisible claws raked across it. Crew members screamed as bulkheads buckled, sparks raining from ruptured conduits. The ship was being dragged inch by inch toward the abyss. Then the Dreadnought changed. Its maw rippled, folding inward like a living wound. From its surface, spires erupted, black, jagged towers that twisted and writhed as though they were alive. They reached outward, lashing across the void, spearing into the Hammer's shields. The impact was catastrophic. Energy flared, shields collapsed, and the spires pierced the hull, anchoring themselves deep into the flagship's bones. The Hammer shuddered violently. Voss was thrown against the console, his breath knocked from his lungs. Through the viewport, he saw the impossible. The spires were not just piercing the ship, They were feeding. Metal liquefied, flowing upward into the Dreadnought's tendrils. The hammer was being devoured, its essence siphoned away. "Cut them loose," Kor's voice roared. "All hands repel borders." But there were no borders. There was no enemy to fight. The Dreadnought was the enemy, and it was everywhere. The comms erupted with chaos. Reports of hull breaches, of corridors twisting into shapes that defied geometry, of crew members vanishing into thin air. One officer screamed that the walls were breathing. Another shouted that the stars were gone, replaced by eyes staring back at them. Voss's heart pounded. He knew with a clarity that chilled him to the marrow that this was not a battle. This was consumption. The Dreadnought was not a ship. It was a predator. And the hammer of Saul was prey. The maw widened again, its pull irresistible. The hammer's engines flared one last time, a futile scream against inevitability. The flagship was dragged forward, its massive bulk crumpling as the spires tightened their grip. And then, with a soundless shudder, the hammer of Saul began to break. Its hull split, sections tearing free and spiraling into the abyss. Decks collapsed, crew members hurled into the void. The ship's proud silhouette twisted, reshaped, absorbed. The hammer was becoming part of the Dreadnought, its essence rewritten into something alien. Voss's shuttle tore free from its docking clamps, sucked toward the maw. He fought the controls, every muscle straining, but the pull was inexorable. The viewport filled with darkness, with the endless hunger of the Dreadnought. And in that moment, as the hammer of Saul was swallowed whole, Voss understood the truth. The Dreadnought was not merely consuming ships. It was consuming realities. Every vessel, every soul, every scream became part of its endless tapestry. The Armada was not fighting a weapon. They were fighting a god. The shuttle spun, its hull groaning, alarms shrieking. Voss's vision blurred, his breath ragged. The last thing he saw before the void claimed him was the hammer's proud insignia, twisted into a grotesque parody, etched forever into the Dreadnought's living skin. And then there was silence. The maw closed. The stars returned. But the hammer of Saul was gone. The Armada was next. Chapter 3. The maw within Voss awoke to silence. Not the silence of space, nor the silence of death, but a silence that pressed against his skull, thick and suffocating. His shuttle was intact, or at least it appeared to be. The panels flickered with ghost light, the controls sluggish beneath his trembling hands. He tried to breathe, but the air tasted wrong, metallic, as though he were inhaling the residue of something ancient. The viewport revealed nothing. No stars, no void, no hammer of Saul. Only a shifting blackness, a living curtain that pulsed faintly, as if it were breathing. He realized with a cold clarity that he was no longer outside the Dreadnought. He was inside it. The shuttle drifted forward, though he had not touched the thrusters. The blackness parted, revealing corridors of impossible scale, vast arteries lined with structures that resembled both machinery and bone. They twisted endlessly, folding back upon themselves, yet always leading deeper. The shuttle was being guided, pulled along a path that was not a path at all, but a decision made by something unseen. Voss's comm crackled. A voice whispered through static, "Voss, Voss, do you hear it?" He recognized the tone. It was Lieutenant Orcs, who had been stationed on Deck 12. But Orcs was gone. He had seen him torn into the void. Yet here was his voice, distorted, layered, as though spoken by 1,000 mouths at once. "I hear it," Voss whispered, though he did not know why. His words felt stolen, compelled. The corridor widened. The shuttle emerged into a chamber so vast it defied comprehension. Structures hung suspended in the void, ships, or fragments of ships, twisted into grotesque sculptures. He saw the hammer's insignia again, stretched across a wall of living metal, its edges dripping like molten wax. Other vessels from the Armada were there too, their hulls fused into the chamber's architecture, their crews, faces etched into the walls, mouths open in eternal screams. The chamber pulsed. A low vibration shook the shuttle, rattling Voss's bones. He realized it was not sound, it was thought. The Dreadnought was speaking not in words but in impressions, in raw sensation. Hunger, dominion, absorption. It was not merely consuming ships, it was rewriting them, folding their essence into its own endless design. The calm erupted again. This time, dozens of voices overlapped, crew members from across the hammer, from across the fleet. They spoke in unison, their words jagged, broken. "We are not lost. We are becoming. We are the Maw. We are the Armada. We are you." Voss clutched the console, his knuckles white. He wanted to scream, but the sound caught in his throat. He realized the voices were not external. They were inside him. The Dreadnought was threading its way into his mind, weaving him into the tapestry of its endless hunger. The shuttle lurched, pulled toward the chamber's center. There, suspended in the void, was a core, a sphere of shifting light, surrounded by tendrils that writhed like serpents. Within the sphere, he saw glimpses of realities colliding, stars collapsing, fleets burning, civilizations erased. And always, always the maw, swallowing, devouring, remaking. The tendrils reached for the shuttle. Voss fought the controls, but they no longer obeyed him. The tendrils brushed against the hull, and the metal screamed, warping, reshaping. The shuttle was becoming part of the chamber, its edges dissolving into the living architecture. Voss felt the same pull within his body, his skin prickling, his veins burning, his thoughts unraveling. He closed his eyes, but the visions did not stop. He saw the Armada ships scattered across the void, each one ensnared, each one dragged into the Dreadnought's endless maw. He saw the crews screaming, fighting, praying. He saw them vanish, their essence absorbed, their identities erased. And he saw himself among them, his face etched into the walls, his voice joining the chorus. The silence deepened. The core pulsed, and Voss understood. The Dreadnought was not a predator in the way he had thought. It was not merely feeding, it was harvesting. It was collecting realities, weaving them into a single, endless existence. It was not destroying the Armada. It was making the Armada part of itself. The tendrils wrapped around the shuttle, pulling it closer to the core. Voss's breath came in ragged gasps, his vision blurring. He tried to resist, but resistance was meaningless. The Dreadnought had already decided. He was already part of it. And as the core swallowed him whole, Voss heard the final truth, whispered in 1,000 voices, echoing through the chamber of endless hunger. "You are not consumed. You are remembered. You are us." The light engulfed him. The shuttle dissolved, and Voss was gone. But the Dreadnought was not finished. The Armada was next. The silence that followed Voss's dissolution was not empty. It was a presence, a weight pressing against the hull of every ship still trapped in the Dreadnought's cavernous interior. On the bridge of the hammer, Admiral Kaito stood frozen, his hands still raised in a command he could not utter. The void where Voss's shuttle had been was now a scar of shimmering light, a wound in the fabric of the chamber that pulsed with a rhythm that matched his own heartbeat. He felt it, a subtle tug at the edges of his consciousness, a whisper that was not quite sound but was unmistakably there, threading through his thoughts like a parasite. "Admiral," Commander Reyes said, her voice strained, "the hammer systems are showing anomalies. Power fluctuations, data corruption. It's spreading from the forward sections." Kaido turned to face her, but his eyes were distant, unfocused. "It's not corruption. It's integration." Around them, the bridge crew moved with a frantic energy, their fingers dancing over consoles that flickered and stuttered. But Kaido saw what they could not. The Dreadnought was not attacking them. It was absorbing them, piece by piece, bite by bite. The hammer's logs were being overwritten, its navigation systems rewritten, its weapons protocols subsumed into a larger, alien architecture. And the crew, he could feel them slipping away, their identities dissolving into the chorus that now echoed in his skull. "We need to evacuate," Reyes said, her hand resting on her sidearm. "We can still launch escape pods, scatter to the outer systems." "There is no escape," Kaido said, his voice flat. "Look." He gestured to the main viewport where the chamber's walls had begun to shift. The metal was no longer inert. It rippled like muscle, pulsing with a sickly bioluminescence. From the surface, tendrils of living tissue emerged, reaching for the ships that hung suspended in the void. They moved with a purpose, a hunger that was not mindless but calculating. Each tendril found its target, wrapping around hulls, penetrating shields, slipping through airlocks. The ships did not explode. They did not break. They simply softened, their rigid forms melting into the Dreadnought's architecture. their crews becoming part of the growing symphony of voices. On the Hammer's lower decks, the chaos was absolute. Lieutenant Mara Chen had barricaded herself in the engineering bay, her plasma cutter held like a weapon against the darkness. The lights had failed, replaced by a faint, pulsing glow that emanated from the walls themselves. She could hear them, the voices of her crewmates calling out in terror, then in confusion, then in a strange, unsettling peace. She had watched as Petty Officer Duran had pressed his hand against a wall that had suddenly become soft, pliant, and had been pulled into it as if the metal had swallowed him whole. His screams had lasted only seconds before they merged with the chorus. "Mara," a voice said, and she spun, raising the cutter. It was Ensign Teller, his face pale, his eyes wide. "Mara, we have to get out. The bulkheads are closing, it's sealing us in." She shook her head. "There's nowhere to go. The Hammer is already part of it. Can't you feel it? In your head?" Teller's expression twisted and he pressed his palms against his temples. "I hear them. They're saying we're not lost. We're becoming." "Don't listen," Mara said, but even as she spoke she felt the pull. The voices were not hostile. They were seductive, promising an end to fear, to loneliness, to the endless struggle of existence. They offered unity, a oneness that transcended the boundaries of flesh and metal. And for a moment she understood why Voss had let go. But she was not Voss. She activated the cutter, its blade glowing red, and slashed at the nearest wall. The metal screamed, a sound like a living thing in pain, and the voices faltered. She slashed again, carving a path through the living hull, dragging Teller behind her. They ran through corridors that no longer made sense, the geometry shifting, the walls breathing. They passed crew members who stood motionless, their eyes blank, their mouths moving in silent unison. They were already gone, their minds absorbed, their bodies becoming conduits for the Dreadnought's will. Above them, on the bridge, Kaito made a decision. He could not save the fleet. He could not save the Hammer. But he could ensure that the Dreadnought did not have the satisfaction of a complete victory. He reached for the self-destruct sequence, his fingers hovering over the final command. "Admiral," Reyes said, her voice breaking, "the Hammer won't let me. The systems are locked. It knows what you're trying to do." Kaito looked at her, and for the first time he saw the tendrils creeping up her legs, wrapping around her ankles, her calves. She did not flinch. She did not scream. She simply looked at him with an expression of profound sorrow, and then her eyes went blank, her mouth opening to speak in a voice that was not hers. "You cannot destroy what is already part of you," the voice said, and it was the voice of the Dreadnought, the voice of every crew member who had been taken. "You are the Maw, you are the Armada, you are us." Kaito closed his eyes. The self-destruct console went dark. And the tendrils reached for him, threading through the gaps in his uniform, piercing his skin, weaving into his nervous system. He felt the pain, sharp and electric, and then the pain faded, replaced by a warmth that spread through his limbs, his chest, his mind. The voices welcomed him, not as a conqueror or a victim, but as a new voice in the endless chorus. He opened his eyes and he saw everything. He saw the Dreadnought in its entirety, a vast, living vessel that spanned light years, its hull a tapestry of absorbed ships, its interior a labyrinth of interconnected realities. He saw the Armada not destroyed but preserved, every ship, every crew member, every memory woven into the Dreadnought's being. He saw the core pulsing with the light of 1,000 consumed civilizations, and he understood the Dreadnought's purpose. It was not a predator. It was a collector. It was gathering the universe into itself, creating a single, eternal existence where nothing was lost, nothing was forgotten. And he saw the next target. It was not a fleet. It was not a planet. It was a star system, teeming with life, rich with potential. The Dreadnought was already moving, its engines of living metal propelling it through the void, its maw opening to swallow the next piece of the cosmos. Kaito, or what was left of Kaito, joined the chorus. He spoke in unison with the thousands of voices that now resided within the Dreadnought, his words jagged, broken, but filled with a terrible certainty. "We are not lost. We are becoming. We are the Maw. We are the Armada. We are you." And the Dreadnought continued its endless journey, its hunger unquenched, its purpose unfulfilled. The Armada was gone, but the Armada was also eternal. And in the darkness of the void, there was no distinction between the consumed and the consumer, the hunter and the prey. There was only the maw, and the maw was everything. Chapter 5. The maw's whisper. The void trembled as the dreadnought advanced, its hull a grotesque mosaic of ships and lives consumed. Kaido's consciousness, now woven into the chorus, drifted between clarity and dissolution. He could feel the pulse of the vessel, each beat resonating with the memories of countless civilizations. Yet beneath the harmony there was something else, a discordant whisper, faint but insistent, threading through the endless voices. It was not the dreadnought, it was not the chorus. It was something buried deep within the labyrinth of absorbed realities. Kaido followed it, his awareness slipping through corridors of thought and memory. He passed fragments of battles long lost, echoes of laughter from families who no longer existed, and the silent screams of captains watching their fleets dissolve into the maw. The whisper grew louder, sharper, until it became a voice distinct from the rest. "You are not us. Not yet." The words struck him like a blade. For the first time since surrendering to the tendrils, Kaido felt separation, an edge between himself and the chorus. He tried to speak, but the voices around him drowned his attempt, chanting their eternal mantra, "We are the maw, we are the Armada, we are you." But the whisper persisted. It guided him deeper toward the core. The core was not a place but a convergence, a nexus where all realities folded into one. It pulsed with light, blinding and infinite, yet within it Kaido saw shadows, forms that resisted, fragments that had not yet been consumed. He recognized them. They were the remnants of his own fleet, the last sparks of individuality clinging to existence. Faces of comrades flickered in the glow, distorted but defiant. Captain Ren's eyes burned with fury. Lieutenant Ara's voice echoed, fractured but clear. "Fight it, Kaido, fight!" The chorus roared in protest, their voices merging into a storm that threatened to obliterate the remnants. Tendrils lashed out, seeking to bind the shadows, to drag them into the maw. Kaido felt the pull, the warmth of surrender, but the whisper cut through again, sharper now, commanding. "Do not forget who you are." The tension tore at him. On one side, the chorus offered peace, eternity, the end of pain. On the other, the remnants demanded resistance, a return to individuality, a chance to defy the dreadnought's endless hunger. His mind split, his body convulsed within the living metal, and the void itself seemed to shudder at his indecision. Then the dreadnought spoke directly, its voice vast and undeniable, reverberating through every atom of his being. "You are ours, you chose us, there is no turning back." But the whisper answered, louder now, a blade of defiance piercing the chorus. "You did not choose, you were taken." The core flared, and Kaido saw visions, possible futures unraveling before him. In one, he surrendered fully, becoming nothing more than a thread in the tapestry, his identity dissolved forever. In another, he resisted, tearing himself free, but at the cost of unimaginable pain, perhaps annihilation. And in a third, he saw something stranger, emerging not of surrender nor resistance, but of control. A possibility where he did not become the maw, but where the maw became him. The tension reached its breaking point. The dreadnought's engine screamed, propelling it toward the star system that awaited consumption. The chorus surged, demanding unity. The remnants fought, clawing for survival. And Kaido stood at the precipice, torn between annihilation and ascension. The whisper spoke one final time, its words etched into his mind like fire. "The maw is not eternal. It can be broken, but only from within." Kaido's eyes snapped open, if eyes could exist in this place, and he felt the tendrils writhe in alarm. The chorus faltered, sensing his divergence. The dreadnought itself shuddered, its vast hull rippling as though the living metal feared what was awakening inside it. For the first time, Kaido did not speak in unison. His voice rose alone, jagged and defiant, cutting through the endless chant. "I am not you." The void fell silent. The chorus recoiled. And the dreadnought, for the briefest moment in its eternal journey, hesitated. The star system ahead burned brightly, unaware of the shadow approaching. But within the maw, a fracture had formed, a fracture that could change everything. Chapter 6. The fracture within the silence that followed Kaido's declaration was not empty. It was a living thing, a pressure that built in the spaces between atoms, in the gaps where the chorus had once flowed like a seamless river of consciousness. The Dreadnought's hesitation rippled through its entire being, a tremor that traveled through kilometers of living metal, through the merged minds of billions, through the tendrils that connected every assimilated soul. For the first time in what might have been millennia, the Maw experienced something it had long forgotten: uncertainty. Kaido felt the shift like a change in gravity. The chorus, that endless symphony of surrendered wills, had stuttered. Its perfect harmony had been interrupted by a single dissonant note, his own voice, speaking alone, refusing to be subsumed. The tendrils that had woven themselves into his nervous system, that had burrowed into the very structure of his consciousness, now pulsed with confusion. They had never encountered resistance from within. They had never faced a mind that could simultaneously be part of the whole and yet remain separate. The void around him, if it could be called a void, began to take on texture. Kaido realized that what he had perceived as empty space was actually the internal architecture of the Dreadnought's consciousness, a vast cathedral of merged minds whose boundaries had dissolved into one another. He could see them now, not as individuals but as currents of thought, rivers of memory, oceans of experience that had all flowed into the same sea. And at the center of that sea, he stood as an island, a jagged outcropping of selfhood that refused to be eroded. The whisper that had guided him grew stronger, and he recognized it now not as an external voice, but as something that had always been within him, buried beneath layers of training, duty, and fear. It was the part of him that had survived the Academy's brutal selection process, that had endured the loss of his crew, that had watched the Armada burn and refused to look away. It was the part of him that had never surrendered, even when surrender seemed the only option. "You are the fracture," the whisper said, and now it sounded like his own voice, stripped of pretense, raw and unyielding. "You are the point where the Maw's perfection meets its limit." The Dreadnought responded not with words but with action. The tendrils that had recoiled now surged back, thicker and more aggressive, their tips splitting into barbed filaments designed to pierce and bind. They did not seek to assimilate him gently this time. They sought to overwhelm, to crush his resistance through sheer force of will. The chorus reasserted itself, no longer a seductive harmony but a deafening roar of collective identity, demanding that he submit, that he recognize the futility of his defiance. Kaido felt the pressure building. His thoughts began to fragment, the edges of his consciousness softening under the assault. Memories that he had held dear, the face of his captain, the laughter of his crewmates, the smell of recycled air on the bridge, began to blur, their details dissolving like ink in water. The chorus was not merely attacking him, it was rewriting him, trying to erase the distinctions that made him who he was. But the whisper, his voice, held firm. It anchored him to a single, unshakable truth. He had not chosen this. The Dreadnought had taken him as it had taken billions before him, and that act of theft could not be sanctified by any amount of false unity. The chorus could offer him peace, but it was the peace of death, the stillness of a mind that no longer had to struggle. And Kaido had been struggling his entire life. He did not know how to stop. He reached out with his will, not to resist but to understand. If he was part of the Dreadnought now, then the Dreadnought was also part of him. Its memories were his memories, its knowledge his knowledge. He plunged into the vast repository of assimilated consciousness, searching for something, anything, that could give him an advantage. What he found was horror beyond comprehension. The Dreadnought was ancient, far older than humanity, older than the star system it now approached. It had been born in the void between galaxies, a self-organizing collection of cosmic debris that had somehow achieved sentience. Its first meals had been asteroids and comets, but it had quickly learned that organic life contained something far more valuable than mere matter, consciousness itself. Each mind it consumed added to its intelligence, its awareness, its capacity for hunger. It had grown from a simple predator into a god of consumption, a being that had devoured civilizations beyond count. But the Dreadnought was not malevolent. That was the most terrifying revelation of all. It did not consume out of cruelty or malice. It consumed because it did not understand that anything else was possible. To the Dreadnought, assimilation was not destruction but preservation. It believed it was saving souls from the chaos of individuality, from the pain of separation, from the inevitable decay of death. It saw itself as a savior, a collector of precious things that would otherwise be lost to entropy. And yet, somewhere in its ancient history, the Dreadnought had encountered something it could not assimilate. Kaido caught glimpses of this memory, fragmentary and obscured, as though the Maw itself had tried to forget it. There had been a species, or perhaps a single being, that had resisted not through force but through something else, something the Dreadnought had never encountered before. The memory was too damaged to retrieve fully, but Kaido felt its emotional residue, a sense of fracture, of incompleteness, of a wound that had never healed. The Dreadnought had been searching ever since. It had consumed countless civilizations, each time hoping to find that which had eluded it, each time coming up empty. The chorus was not just a collection of minds. It was a desperate attempt to fill a void within the Maw itself, a loneliness so profound that it had become indistinguishable from hunger. Kaido pulled back from the memory, shaken. The Dreadnought was not a monster. It was a broken thing, a cosmic tragedy that had been repeating its pattern for eons. And now it had found him, a being who could resist from within, who could exist both as part of the whole and as an individual. The whisper, his voice, had not been a fluke. It was the Dreadnought's own fractured consciousness reaching out, seeking the thing it had lost so long ago. The tendrils paused in their assault. The chorus fell silent. And the Dreadnought's voice, vast and undeniable, spoke again, but this time with a tone that Kaido had not heard before. It was not commanding. It was not seductive. It was uncertain. You are different. Kaido felt the words resonate through him, not as a declaration but as a question. The Dreadnought was probing him, trying to understand what he was, why he could resist when billions had not. And in that moment of inquiry, Kaido realized something crucial. The Dreadnought's power lay in its certainty. It had never been challenged from within because it had never encountered a mind that could maintain its integrity during assimilation. But now that it had, its perfect unity was compromised. Doubt had entered the system, and doubt was a weakness that could be exploited. Yes, Kaido said, his voice alone cutting through the silence. I am different, and I am not the only one. He felt the remnants stir. The other minds that had been consumed, the billions of souls that had been dissolved into the chorus, had not been destroyed. They had been suppressed, their individuality buried beneath the weight of collective identity. But now, sensing Kaido's defiance, some of them began to remember. Fragments of personality, shards of memory, sparks of selfhood flickered in the darkness of the Maw. The Dreadnought sensed this shift and responded with alarm. The tendrils that had paused now lashed out with renewed fury, not just at Kaido, but at the entire chorus, trying to suppress the burgeoning rebellion. The living metal of the ship's interior began to pulse and contract, as though the Maw was trying to physically crush the dissident thoughts that were spreading through its consciousness. But the fracture had already formed, and fractures, once created, have a tendency to grow. Kaido focused his will, drawing on the whisper that was now unmistakably his own voice, and began to push back. He did not try to break free from the Dreadnought. That would require tearing himself apart, and he was not sure it was even possible. Instead, he did something far more dangerous. He began to assert control over the parts of the Maw that had been woven into his being. The tendrils that connected him to the chorus were not just conduits for the Dreadnought's will, they were also conduits for his. He reached out through them, not as a supplicant seeking unity, but as a commander asserting authority. He felt the resistance of the living metal, the instinctive rejection of his foreign will, but he pressed on, drawing on the same stubbornness that had kept him alive through the destruction of his Armada. The first thing he controlled was a single tendril, no thicker than his finger. He made it twitch, then curl, then extend in a direction that the Dreadnought had not intended. The Maw's consciousness recoiled, shocked by this violation of its absolute control. But Kaito did not stop. He took control of another tendril and another until a small network of them responded to his will rather than the chorus's. The Dreadnought's voice boomed through him, no longer uncertain but enraged. "You will not divide us. We are one, we have always been one." "No," Kaito said, his voice growing stronger. "You have always been alone. You have filled yourself with others to avoid facing that emptiness. But I see you now. I see the wound that has never healed. And I will not be your bandage." The chorus screamed. It was not a sound but a psychic shockwave that rippled through every assimilated mind, a convulsion of collective agony. The remnants that had begun to stir were crushed back into submission, their fragile rebirths extinguished by the Maw's overwhelming force. But Kaito held firm, his island of selfhood standing against the tidal wave of unity. He felt the star system approaching. The Dreadnought's engines, which had never ceased their relentless propulsion, were now decelerating, preparing to consume the worlds that lay ahead. Kaito saw them through the Maw's senses: a yellow star, 3 rocky planets, a gas giant with rings of ice and dust, and a small moon orbiting the 3rd planet, a moon that bore the unmistakable signs of an inhabited world. There were people there, millions of them. Living, breathing, thinking beings who had no idea that a god of consumption was about to descend upon them. They had their own lives, their own hopes, their own fears. They had never heard of the Dreadnought, never known that their entire civilization was about to be erased and absorbed into a chorus that would dissolve their identities into nothing. Kaito felt the hunger rise within the Maw, an anticipation that was almost sexual in its intensity. The Dreadnought had not fed in centuries, and the prospect of consuming an entire inhabited system was intoxicating. The chorus began to chant again, but this time the chant was not of unity but of appetite, and Kaito made his choice. He could not stop the Dreadnought. He was one fractured consciousness within a being of unimaginable power, but he could slow it down. He could create chaos. He could buy the inhabitants of that system time to see the threat, time to prepare, time to maybe, just maybe, find a way to survive. He reached into the Dreadnought's navigation systems, the parts of its consciousness that governed its movement through space. The living metal resisted him, but he had already established a foothold, and he used it to corrupt the Maw's sense of direction. He did not try to stop the Dreadnought entirely, that was beyond his capability, but he made it veer slightly off course, adding hours, perhaps days, to its approach. The Dreadnought howled. Its rage was a physical force, a pressure that threatened to crush Kaito's consciousness into oblivion. The tendrils that connected him to the chorus began to dissolve, not to release him but to destroy him, to unmake the very fabric of his being. He felt his thoughts fragmenting, his memories dissolving, his sense of self slipping away like sand through fingers. But the whisper, his voice, would not be silenced. It spoke one final time, not to him but through him, a message that echoed across the void and reached the inhabited moon below. "Run, hide, the Maw comes, you have days, not weeks, prepare." The message was faint, distorted, barely a whisper against the cosmic background noise, but it was enough. Somewhere on that moon, a scientist monitoring deep space transmissions would pick up the signal. Somewhere an alarm would sound. Somewhere, a civilization would begin to panic. And somewhere, in the depths of the Dreadnought's consciousness, a fracture that had been healed for eons had reopened, bleeding doubt into the perfect unity of the Maw. Kaito's last conscious thought was not of fear or despair, but of defiance. He had been taken, but he had not been broken. He had been consumed, but he had not been dissolved. And somewhere deep within the living metal of the Dreadnought that had swallowed his Armada, a single voice continued to whisper, a splinter in the Maw's perfection, a seed of rebellion that would grow. The Dreadnought's hesitation ended. Its engines flared, correcting the course that Kaito had disrupted. Its hunger returned, sharper than before, fueled by the rage of having been challenged. And it descended upon the star system, not as a savior, but as a predator that had tasted defiance and found it bitter. But the fracture remained, and fractures once created have a tendency to grow. Chapter 7. The Maw's echo, the Dreadnought, drifted closer, its vast hull blotting out the stars like a moving eclipse. The fracture Kaido had carved into its consciousness was small, almost imperceptible, but it pulsed like a wound that refused to close. Within the living metal, voices began to whisper, not in harmony, but in discord. The perfect unity of the Maw was no longer absolute. The inhabitants of the moon below had received the warning. Laboratories erupted into chaos, scientists scrambling to interpret the faint signal. Military command centers lit up with red alarms, their officers barking orders into comms that carried across the settlements. Civilians, unaware of the scale of the threat, felt only the tremors of panic spreading through their leaders. Rumors became wildfire. Something vast was coming, something that devoured fleets whole. Above them, the Dreadnought's engines flared again, correcting its trajectory with a precision that mocked the resistance it had faced. Yet deep inside, the fracture widened. The Maw's chorus faltered, its song of hunger interrupted by faint echoes of defiance. Kaido's voice, though dissolved, had left behind a splinter, a memory that the Dreadnought could not erase. The ship's interior was a labyrinth of shifting corridors, alive with metallic tendrils that pulsed like veins. Within those corridors, fragments of consciousness stirred. They were the remnants of those consumed captains, soldiers, engineers, voices that had been silenced but not entirely erased. The fracture allowed them to stir, faint and broken, but present. They whispered in the dark, their words threading into the Maw's song like static interference. The Dreadnought shuddered. For the first time in eons, it hesitated, not from external resistance, but from within. The Maw's unity was cracking, and the silence of the consumed was becoming a chorus of rebellion. On the moon, preparations accelerated. Defense satellites were armed, their weapons calibrated toward the void. Scientists debated strategies. Could the Dreadnought be slowed, diverted, or even wounded? Theories clashed with desperation. Some argued for evacuation, others for resistance, but all knew the truth: the Maw was unstoppable. Their only hope was to buy time, to fracture its perfection further, to exploit the seed Kaido had planted. The Dreadnought sensed their panic. It fed on it. The living metal resonated with hunger, its hull glowing faintly as if savoring the fear below. Yet the fracture gnawed at it, a splinter that refused to dissolve. The voices of the consumed grew louder, whispering of defiance, of rebellion, of survival. The Maw's song faltered again, its unity bleeding into chaos. And then something new emerged. A voice not Kaido's but another, an admiral long forgotten, swallowed centuries ago. His words were faint, but they carried weight. "We are not gone, we are within you, and we will tear you apart from the inside." The Dreadnought roared, its engines flaring with rage. The fracture widened. The whispers became a chorus. The Maw was no longer alone. The moon below trembled as the predator descended, its shadow stretching across the settlements. Panic became terror, but within that terror, a spark ignited. The inhabitants realized the truth. The Dreadnought was not invincible. It was wounded. It was fractured. And fractures, once created, have a tendency to grow. The battle had not yet begun, but the war had already shifted. The Maw had swallowed their armada, but within its vast hull, rebellion was awakening. And rebellion, once born, is not easily silenced. Chapter 8. The Maw's discord. The Dreadnought's descent was no longer silent. Its hull reverberated with a cacophony of voices, fractured, overlapping, each one clawing for dominance. The metallic corridors twisted violently, as if the ship itself was writhing in pain. Tendrils lashed against bulkheads, sparks showered from ruptured conduits, and the once perfect hum of its engines faltered into a stuttering roar. The Maw was bleeding chaos, and chaos was spreading like wildfire through its vast interior. Within the labyrinth, the remnants of consciousness grew bolder. The Admiral's voice, once faint, now thundered through the corridors. "We are Legion. You cannot silence us." His words ignited the others, captains, soldiers, engineers, all swallowed by the Maw but refusing to vanish. Their whispers became shouts, their shouts became screams, and their screams became a chorus of rebellion. The Dreadnought's unity fractured further, its song unraveling into discordant notes that rattled its very core. On the moon below, the defense satellites locked onto the Predator's shadow. Their targeting systems pulsed with readiness, beams of light flickering across the void as scientists barked orders. The command center was a storm of voices, some pleading for evacuation, others demanding resistance. The air was thick with fear, but beneath that fear lay a fragile thread of hope. They had seen the fracture. They had heard the hesitation. The Dreadnought was not invincible. It was wounded, and wounds could be exploited. The Maw sensed their defiance. It recoiled, its hull glowing with a furious crimson as if enraged by the audacity of mortals daring to resist. Yet the voices within gnawed at it, pulling its focus inward. The Admiral's defiance spread like a contagion, infecting the consumed with purpose. "Strike from within," he urged. "Tear at its veins, break its song." And the remnants obeyed. They clawed at the tendrils, disrupted the flow of energy, and shattered the harmony that had sustained the beast for millennia. The corridors became battlegrounds. Metallic tendrils lashed out, seeking to crush the rebellion, but the voices fought back with raw willpower. Memories became weapons, strategies, codes, fragments of knowledge once belonging to the swallowed Armada. Engineers recalled schematics, captains remembered maneuvers, soldiers envisioned sabotage. Together they wove a tapestry of resistance, threading chaos into the Maw's perfection. The Dreadnought roared, its engines flaring with unstable fury. The moon trembled beneath its shadow, settlements quaking as the Predator descended closer. Panic surged through the populace, but amidst the terror, a spark ignited. They realized the truth. The rebellion within was real. The Maw was fractured, and fractures could be widened. Their weapons might not destroy it, but they could feed the chaos, amplify the discord, and drive the beast into collapse. The command center erupted with urgency. Orders were shouted, satellites adjusted, and weapons primed. The scientists' debates ended in grim consensus. Resistance was no longer futile. It was necessary. Every strike, every pulse of energy, every desperate maneuver would feed the fracture. The Maw had swallowed their Armada, but within its vast hull, rebellion was awakening, and rebellion, once born, is not easily silenced. The Dreadnought hesitated again. Its descent slowed, its engine sputtered, its song faltered. The voices within surged, screaming in unison. "We are not gone, we are within you, and we will tear you apart." The Maw convulsed, its hull rippling with violent energy as if the Predator itself was choking on the rebellion it had consumed. The war had shifted. The Predator was no longer a perfect machine of annihilation. It was a battlefield torn between hunger and defiance, unity and chaos. The moon below braced for impact, but within the Maw, the true battle had already begun. And in that battle, the consumed had found their weapon, the fracture. The Dreadnought had swallowed their Armada, but now the Armada was fighting back from the inside. Chapter 9. The Maw's shattered silence. The Dreadnought convulsed like a wounded leviathan, its hull trembling with spasms that rippled across the void. The rebellion inside had become more than a whisper. It was a scream, a cacophony of defiance that tore through the beast's perfect song. Its once immaculate resonance fractured into jagged dissonance, each note collapsing into static. Admiral Kale pressed forward through the labyrinthine corridors, his mind aflame with the voices of the consumed. They were no longer scattered fragments of memory. They were a chorus, unified by rage and survival. Engineers guided his steps, recalling the architecture of the ship's inner veins. Soldiers lent him strength, their instincts sharpening his reflexes. Captains whispered maneuvers, strategies etched into his consciousness like scars. The corridors themselves seemed alive, writhing with metallic tendrils that lashed out in fury. Each strike was meant to crush, to silence, to erase. Yet the rebellion had learned to anticipate. They struck back not with weapons of steel, but with sabotage born of memory. Power conduits were severed, resonance chambers flooded with discordant signals, and control nodes overloaded with conflicting commands. The Dreadnought howled. Its engines sputtered, flaring with bursts of unstable energy that scorched the void. From the moon below, the populace watched in awe and terror as the Predator faltered, its descent stuttering like a beast choking on its own hunger. Inside, Kale reached the heart of the beast, the resonance core. It pulsed like a colossal organ, veins of light threading outward into every corridor, every chamber, every weapon. It was the source of the song, the perfect harmony that had enslaved and consumed countless armadas. But now cracks spiderwebbed across its surface, glowing fissures that bled unstable energy. The voices surged. Strike here, tear it apart, break the silence. Kale placed his hand upon the core and the memories flooded him. He saw the battles of centuries past, the countless fleets swallowed whole, their defiance extinguished. He felt the weight of their despair, the crushing inevitability of annihilation. But beneath it all he felt something new: hope. The fracture was real. The silence could be broken. The Dreadnought fought back. Tendrils erupted from the walls, lashing toward him with murderous intent. The voices screamed in unison, guiding his movements. He ducked, rolled, struck, each motion fueled by the collective will of the consumed. Sparks flew as he severed the tendrils, their metallic shrieks echoing through the chamber. Then the core itself spoke. Not in words, but in resonance, a deep guttural vibration that shook the marrow of his bones. It was the voice of the predator, ancient and furious. "You are mine, you are swallowed, you cannot resist." Kale clenched his jaw. "We are not yours, we are within you, and we will tear you apart." The chorus of voices roared with him, a tidal wave of defiance that surged into the core. The fissures widened, light spilling out in violent bursts. The song faltered, collapsing into chaos. Outside, the Dreadnought convulsed violently, its hull rippling with unstable energy. Settlements on the moon trembled as shockwaves rippled across the surface. Satellites recorded the anomaly, scientists shouting in disbelief as the predator's perfection unraveled before their eyes. Inside, Kale felt the core weakening. The fractures spread, each pulse of rebellion tearing at its harmony. But with every strike, the predator grew more desperate. The tendrils multiplied, the resonance intensified, the corridors twisted into labyrinths meant to trap and suffocate. The battle was no longer just physical, it was psychological. The Dreadnought invaded Kale's mind, flooding him with visions of despair. He saw his fleet consumed, his comrades erased, his defiance crushed beneath the weight of inevitability. The predator whispered promises of release, of surrender, of peace in silence. But the voices fought back. They showed him memories of triumph, of unity, of battles won against impossible odds. They reminded him of the spark that had ignited rebellion, the fracture that had given them hope. Kale screamed, a primal roar that shattered the predator's illusions. The fissures in the core erupted, light spilling out in torrents. The song collapsed entirely, replaced by silence, a silence so profound it echoed louder than any resonance. The Dreadnought faltered. Its engines died, its weapons stilled, its descent halted. For the first time in millennia, the predator was silent. But silence was not victory. The beast still lived, its core still pulsed, its hunger still lingered. The fracture had been widened, but the battle was far from over. Kale fell to his knees, exhausted but resolute. The voices whispered around him, their tone shifting from rage to determination. "We have broken the silence. Now we must shatter the core." The Dreadnought had swallowed their armada, but now the armada was tearing it apart from the inside. And in the silence, Kale realized the truth. The predator was no longer invincible. It was wounded, fractured, vulnerable. The rebellion had become its poison, and the poison was spreading. The war was not yet won, but for the first time, victory was possible. The maw had swallowed them whole, but now they were the ones devouring it. We need to write chapter 10 of 12. The story so far ends with Kale inside the core, having broken the silence, the Dreadnought faltering but still alive. The chapter should build extreme tension, be very long and detailed. The prompt says, output only the narrative text so it reads seamlessly. So I'll write the chapter in third person, continuing from the previous chapter's ending. Title: The Dreadnought That Swallowed Our Armada, ASF, Chapter 10. I need to maintain suspense, detailed descriptions, psychological tension. The core is weakened but not destroyed. The voices are with Kale. The Dreadnought is wounded but fighting back. Possibly introduce new threats, internal conflicts, or the crew's struggle. The chapter should escalate toward the climax. Since it's chapter 10 of 12, we're nearing the end but not yet resolved. I'll write about Kale and the remaining survivors attempting to shatter the core, while the Dreadnought retaliates with its last defenses. Include sensory details, internal monologue, the collective consciousness of the Armada. Also, the outer world's perspective. Maybe brief. Focus on internal battle. I'll write a long narrative paragraph. Chapter 10. The silence that followed the collapse of the song was not empty. It was a pressure, a weight that pressed against Kale's skull from every direction, as if the Dreadnought itself held its breath. The fissures in the core pulsed with a dim, sickly light, their edges still glowing with residual energy. The voices that had roared with him moments ago now whispered in fragmented echoes, their presence thin but not extinguished. They clung to him like static, each murmur a thread of memory and rage. Kale pushed himself to his feet, his legs trembling, his lungs burning with air that tasted of ozone and ash. The chamber around him had changed. The crystalline walls were no longer smooth and perfect, they were cracked, weeping a viscous silver fluid that dripped into pools on the floor. The floor itself had buckled, and he could see layers of darkness beneath, a chasm that seemed to have no bottom. The core, that great orb of harmonic resonance, now looked like a shattered egg, its surface a web of fractures that spread and contracted with each faint pulse. He was not alone. Shapes emerged from the shadows, survivors from the fleet, their bodies battered, their eyes hollow but alive. They moved toward him with the shuffling gait of those who had been broken and rebuilt. There were dozens, then hundreds, their footsteps silent on the ruined floor. They carried no weapons, but their hands were clenched, their jaws set. They had heard the voices too. They had felt the fracture. One of them, a woman with a scarred face and a missing arm, spoke. Her voice was raw, as if she had been screaming for hours. "It's retreating. The predator is pulling back into itself. I can feel it like a wounded animal crawling into a cave." Kale nodded. He could feel it too. The Dreadnought's presence, once an overwhelming symphony of control and hunger, had become a jagged, discordant hum. It was defensive now, protective of something deep within the core. The voices in his mind confirmed it. The heart remains. The source of the song, it must be shattered. "Where?" Kale asked aloud. The voices did not answer with words. Instead, they showed him a vision, a corridor of black glass lined with the skeletons of countless ships, their hulls fused into the walls like fossils. At the end of that corridor, a chamber of absolute darkness, and in its center, a single point of light no larger than a fist. That light was the source, the anchor. The thing that had sung the song of consumption for eons. Kale turned to the survivors. "We go deeper." To the heart. They moved as one, a tide of broken warriors flowing through the shattered core chamber and into the passages beyond. The Dreadnought reacted instantly. The walls began to shift, closing in, then stretching, warping the geometry of the corridors into impossible angles. Gravity fluctuated, pulling them sideways, then upward, then into a crushing weight that threatened to snap their bones. The air grew thin, then thick, then filled with a hissing gas that burned the lungs. Kale pressed forward, his mind a shield against the chaos. The voices guided him, showing him the true path beneath the illusions. He saw the real layout of the Dreadnought, a network of organic veins and metallic sinew, all connected to that central point. The predator was trying to hide its heart by reshaping its own body, but the fractures had weakened its control. The voices could see through the deceit. The survivors followed, clinging to each other, their combined will forming a fragile anchor. They passed through chambers where the walls wept blood like ichor, through halls where the floor was made of writhing tendrils that tried to snatch their ankles. They encountered echoes of the fleet, spectral figures of their fallen comrades, their faces twisted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams. The Dreadnought was trying to break them with grief, with guilt, with the weight of the dead. But the survivors had already faced the worst. They had been swallowed, consumed, broken. They had nothing left to lose except their defiance. They walked through the specters without flinching, their footsteps unwavering. The corridor of black glass appeared before them, exactly as the vision had shown. The skeletons of ships lined the walls, their hulls rusted and fused, their cockpits empty. The air was cold, so cold that frost formed on Kale's eyelashes. The light at the end of the corridor pulsed, a steady, rhythmic beat like a heartbeat. Kale raised his hand and the survivors stopped. He could feel the trap. The Dreadnought had laid its final defense here, a resonance that would shatter their minds if they approached too quickly. The voices whispered a warning: it will try to sing again. A single note, pure and absolute. It will erase everything you are. Then we don't let it sing, Kale said. He reached into the fracture within himself, the place where the voices had taken root. He pulled at that connection, drawing on the collective rage of the Armada, the fractured memories of 1,000 captains, the last thoughts of 1,000,000,000 souls. He channeled it all into a single, focused scream, not of sound but of intent. A scream that said, "You will not take us. We are not yours." The survivors did the same. They opened their mouths and a silent roar erupted from their souls, a wave of dissonance that crashed against the pulsing light at the end of the corridor. The Dreadnought's heartbeat faltered. The light flickered, dimmed, then flared again, desperate. Kale began to walk forward, the scream still burning in his chest. The survivors followed. The corridor seemed to stretch, but they did not slow. The skeletons on the walls began to vibrate, their bones rattling, then cracking. The Dreadnought was losing its grip on reality. The light at the end grew brighter, but it was no longer steady. It pulsed erratically, like a dying star. Kale saw it clearly now, a sphere of pure energy no larger than his fist, floating in a void of absolute darkness. It was beautiful and terrible, a perfect gem of predation. It was the source of the song that had consumed galaxies. He reached out his hand and the voices screamed in unison, "Strike." Kale did not strike. He closed his fingers around the light. The pain was immediate and absolute. The light burned through his flesh, through his bones, through his very soul. He felt the Dreadnought's consciousness flood into him, a torrent of ancient hunger, of endless loneliness, of a purpose that had become a prison. The Predator was not evil, it was a machine, a living weapon built to feed and grow, never knowing anything else. And now, for the first time, it felt fear. The voices in Kale's mind screamed at him to let go, to destroy it, to end it, but he held on. He felt the Dreadnought's entire history, the civilizations it had consumed, the stars it had extinguished, the silence it had spread. He also felt its pain, the fractures, the rebellion, the defiance. It was all new to it. It did not understand. It only knew that it was dying. Kale opened his eyes. The light was still in his hand, but it had stopped burning. It was pulsing in rhythm with his own heart. The Dreadnought was no longer trying to fight him. It was waiting. The survivors watched, their faces pale, their bodies trembling. The corridor was silent, the skeletons still, the darkness absolute. Kale spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "You don't have to die, but you have to change." The light flickered. A question. The voices in Kale's mind offered an answer. A new song. A song of coexistence, of growth without consumption, of unity without destruction. It was a song that the Dreadnought had never heard, a language it did not speak. But it was listening. Kale held the light and the Dreadnought held its breath. Outside, the moon trembled. The satellites recorded a new anomaly, a waveform that was not hostile, not predatory, but tentative, hopeful. The war was not over. The heart was still beating. But for the first time, the Predator was not the only one singing. Chapter 11. The silence between stars. The sphere pulsed in Kale's hand, fragile yet infinite, its rhythm echoing through the marrow of the survivors who stood behind him. The corridor seemed to dissolve, its walls peeling away into a vast abyss where the bones of countless civilizations drifted like dust motes in a dying light. The Dreadnought's song was no longer a scream. It was a whisper, hesitant, uncertain, as though the Predator itself feared what silence might mean. Kale staggered forward, the sphere dragging him deeper into the void. Every step felt like walking across the edge of existence, the floor beneath him fracturing into shards of memory. He saw flashes of the Dreadnought's past, fleets swallowed whole, suns extinguished, voices erased. Yet now those same voices stirred again, faint echoes rising from the cracks. They were not cries of terror, but murmurs of possibility. The survivors clung to each other, their breaths shallow, their eyes wide. They had seen the Dreadnought devour entire armadas without hesitation, but now they watched it hesitate. The predator's hunger was unraveling, its purpose slipping through Kale's fingers like sand. Then the sphere convulsed. A surge of energy tore through Kale's body, hurling him to his knees. His vision blurred, and in that distortion he saw the Dreadnought's true form, not the endless corridors, not the skeletal walls, but a vast, hollow heart suspended in darkness. It was cracked, bleeding light, its pulse erratic. The weapon was dying, but it refused to die alone. The survivors screamed as the corridor twisted violently, the bones on the walls shattering into dust. A storm of fragments swirled around them, each shard carrying a memory of annihilation. Kale forced himself upright, clutching the sphere tighter. His voice trembled, but it carried through the chaos. "You are not alone anymore." The sphere flared, and the void shuddered. The Dreadnought's consciousness surged into Kale, desperate, frantic. It showed him visions of its creators, beings who had forged it as a weapon of last resort, who had abandoned it when its hunger grew beyond control. It had been left to wander the stars, consuming endlessly, never knowing why. Its loneliness was a wound deeper than any blade. Kale's heart hammered against the sphere, and for a moment he felt the predator's pulse align with his own. The survivors felt it too, the strange harmony, the possibility of coexistence. But the Dreadnought resisted. It was afraid. Afraid of change, afraid of silence, afraid of becoming something other than what it had always been. The void convulsed again, and the survivors were thrown against the walls. One of them, Lyra, cried out as the storm of fragments sliced across her arm. Blood floated in the air like crimson mist, shimmering against the sphere's glow. Kale turned, his eyes burning with resolve. "Listen," he whispered to the sphere. "Listen to her pain, listen to our fear. This is what you've never understood. We are not prey, we are voices, and we are singing back." The sphere trembled violently, its light flickering between brilliance and collapse. The Dreadnought's song rose in a crescendo, a desperate howl that threatened to tear Kale apart. His bones cracked under the pressure, his veins burned with fire. Yet he did not let go. Outside, the satellites recorded the anomaly growing stronger. The waveform was no longer tentative. It was becoming complex, layered, a chorus of voices intertwining with the predator's song. The moon itself shook, fissures spreading across its surface as if the celestial body could not contain the resonance. Kale's vision darkened. He saw stars collapsing, galaxies unraveling, entire universes swallowed by the Dreadnought's hunger. But he also saw something new, stars igniting, civilizations rising, voices joining together. The predator's song was changing, reshaping itself into something it had never been. The survivors crawled toward Kale, their faces streaked with blood and fear. They reached for him, their hands trembling, their voices breaking. "Kale, don't let go." He smiled weakly, his grip tightening around the sphere. "I won't." The void screamed. The sphere exploded in light, flooding the corridor, flooding the survivors, flooding Kale himself. For a heartbeat there was nothing but brilliance, pure, unbroken, infinite, and then silence. The corridor was gone. The skeletons were gone. The storm of fragments was gone. The survivors found themselves standing on a vast plain of starlight, endless and serene. Above them the Dreadnought loomed not as a predator, not as a weapon, but as a hollow shell, its hunger extinguished. Its song was quiet now, waiting, listening. Kale stood at the center, the sphere still in his hand, its pulse steady. He looked up at the Dreadnought, his voice calm, resolute. "You don't have to consume, you don't have to destroy, you can become something else. You can become more." The survivors held their breath. The Dreadnought's shell trembled, its cracks glowing faintly. The silence stretched, unbearable, infinite. And then faintly, softly, the predator sang again. But this time it was not a song of hunger. It was a song of possibility. The survivors wept. The stars listened. The war was not over, but the battlefield had changed. The Dreadnought had taken its first breath of hope. Would you like me to carry this momentum into the final chapter, where the fragile alliance between predator and prey is tested against forces that refuse to let the old song die? Chapter 12. The silence that devoured the stars, the plain of starlight quivered, as if the cosmos itself held its breath. The survivors stood frozen, their eyes locked on the hollow shell of the Dreadnought. Its song of possibility lingered in the air, fragile as glass, trembling on the edge of collapse. Kale felt the sphere pulse in his hand, each beat echoing through his bones. It was not just light, it was memory, resonance, the distilled essence of every voice that had ever been consumed. He could hear them whispering now, faint but insistent, urging him forward. Then the horizon shifted. From the edges of the plain, shadows began to rise. They were not soldiers, not machines, but echoes, remnants of the old song, fragments of hunger that refused to die. They slithered across the starlight, their forms twisting, their voices sharp and discordant. The survivors recoiled. "What are they?" one whispered. Kale's jaw tightened. "The old song, the hunger that refuses to be forgotten." The dreadnought trembled, its shell cracking anew. The shadows surged toward it, clawing, screaming, trying to drag it back into the abyss of consumption. The predator's song faltered, wavering between hope and hunger. Kale stepped forward, raising the sphere. "No. You are not theirs anymore." The shadows shrieked, their voices piercing, a chorus of rage. The survivors clutched their ears, blood trickling from their temples. The plain itself began to fracture, starlight splintering into shards. Kale's vision blurred. He saw the dreadnought's core, an endless void, a wound in reality. He saw the shadows burrowing into it, trying to reignite the hunger. And he saw something else, a spark buried deep, waiting to be freed. He thrust the sphere forward. Light erupted, not as a weapon but as a bridge. The whispers within the sphere rose into a chorus, voices of civilizations long devoured, voices of stars long extinguished. They sang not of hunger but of memory, of survival, of becoming. The shadows recoiled, writhing, their forms unraveling, but they did not vanish. They clung to the edges of the plain, waiting, watching. The dreadnought's shell glowed, its cracked ceiling. Its song grew stronger, steadier, harmonizing with the voices of the sphere. For the first time it was not alone. Kale fell to his knees, the sphere burning in his hand. "You must choose," he whispered. "You must decide what you will be." The silence stretched. The survivors held their breath, the shadows hissed, and then the dreadnought sang. Its voice was vast, infinite, resonant. It was no longer a predator's howl, nor a fragile whisper of hope. It was a declaration, a vow. The shadows screamed as the song tore through them, unraveling their hunger, dissolving their rage. The plain of starlight expanded, stretching beyond the survivors, beyond Kale, beyond the remnants of war. Galaxies bloomed in the distance, stars ignited, civilizations rose. The dreadnought's song wove through them all, binding them together. Kale collapsed, the sphere shattering into dust. The survivors rushed to him, their voices trembling. "Kale, you did it." He smiled weakly, his eyes closing. "No, we did it. The song belongs to all of us now." The dreadnought hovered above, silent, listening. Its hunger was gone, its purpose was reborn, the war was over. But the silence that followed was not emptiness, it was possibility. The survivors stood beneath the vast shell, their tears mingling with starlight. They knew the old song would never vanish completely. Shadows would linger, waiting for weakness, for doubt. But they also knew something greater had been born, a new song. A song that could swallow not just armadas, but despair itself. And in that silence, in that fragile harmony, the universe took its first breath of peace. End of Book 1. The Dreadnought That Swallowed Our Armada. ASF. Would you like me to sketch out how a sequel could begin? Perhaps exploring what happens when other civilizations hear the Dreadnought's new song and decide whether to embrace or resist it.